to this week's expert session. Today's role model is Bryon Morrison, co-founder and CEO of Proxxy. And today's topic is called Chief of Staff, a role you can leverage today to find the time to work on the firm. This is an area where Bryon is a true expert. To get the most out of this session, you should have read Chapter 16, Replication, and listened to Episode 101. If you did not get around to it, I encourage you to do so following this session. We are going to start with Greg summarizing the big idea, and then we'll pull Bryon into the discussion. So Greg, why don't you take it away?
Okay, so the big idea. So I see some repeat visitors this week, and thank you for that. But those that were on the call on Wednesday are also here on the call on Friday. So I'm going to summarize the big idea much quicker because I want to give most of the airtime to Bryon and pick his brain on this very important topic. So this topic is all about how to scale yourself as a founder or a co-founder. And I call that in the boutique replication. And what that's meant to indicate is how do you replicate yourself in someone else in your firm? Now, why do you care? Well, as you all know, our life cycle of a firm has 3 phases: grow, scale, and exit. 15 years in total, 5 years in each stage. And when you leave the growth stage and get into the scale stage, a very bad thing starts to happen. And that is you, as the founder, become the bottleneck. You went from being the strength of the firm to being the liability of the firm. And old habits are tough to break. And the reason why you become a bottleneck is because you're still required to be everywhere and do everything yourself. You haven't started replicating yourself just yet. And in the early days, it's not that big of a deal because it's a small firm. There's only so many clients, only so much to do. But as you scale, you get bigger, more clients, more employees. It's just too much work for a single person to do it. So you have to start delegating. Now, there's a sequence of steps that you take along the way. First, you start delegating what's considered to be kind of non-core capability. So these are the cost of doing business items, if you will. They have to get done, but they don't necessarily have to get done by you anymore. Eventually, as you progress through scale and someday get to exit, you're going to have to delegate everything. And the firm is going to have to be able to be run without you. Other people have to do what you can do as good as you can do it, if not better. Now, that's a really hard thing to do. But if you don't do it, you're never going to be able to sell your firm. And if you don't do it, you're really going to top out at scale. And the reason for that is this: investors are not going to buy your firm if they think the firm is dependent upon you. God forbid you get sick, you get hit by a car crossing the street, who knows what, and the firm goes poof overnight. So no one's going to put any real money behind a firm like that. And then secondly, your loyal, long-standing employees are going to start to leave you. The reason why they're going to start to leave you is because you've plateaued, so therefore the firm has plateaued, and you and they are trapped in a lifestyle business. So there's no progression for them, no career progression. So it's absolutely essential that you replicate yourself and others to give people plenty of opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that you become obsolete, quite the contrary. It means that you recast yourself. You start pushing yourself up the value pyramid, if you will, and you start working on your vision, your 1, 3, 5, 10-year vision. When I say working on it, I don't mean defining it. I mean executing it. Yes, you've got to start by defining it, but you've got to start then bringing it to life by putting energy around it, investing your time, investing your energy, your money, et cetera, making that happen. Now, there's a giant obstacle to pulling this off, and here's what it is. It's called the entrepreneur's myth. And the entrepreneur's myth is as follows. When you start a business, you start the business and you say, I want to work for myself. That's the myth. The reason why that's the myth is because you never really work for yourself. You start your firm and you work for your clients. They pay the invoice, you got to work for them. So right away, it's not really true that you're working for yourself. Yes, you have some freedom. You don't have the boss in a traditional defined way, and you can choose the kind of work you do, the type of business you're in, et cetera, but you're still working for your clients. Then you get a little bigger and you start hiring employees, and you realize, guess what? Now you're working for your employees. Why is that? Well, if your employees start quitting, if your employees aren't well trained, they can't do the job, then your business is on a road to nowhere. So you have to support your employees. So now you're working for them, really. Then eventually you end up working for your investors. All of you someday are going to sell your firms. We laugh here at Collective 54 and saying that sometimes people think they're not going to exit. Well, you're going to die. You can't run your business from the grave. So you're exiting whether you like it or not. Now, the question is, when do you exit and on what terms? Usually a professional services firms exit and they have some type of earnout or some type of equity role, which means post-sale, they got to stick around for 2 or 3 years. And during that time period, you're working for your investors. So that's the myth. Now, how painful is that myth is what we're talking about today. If you're able to scale yourself, because you can replicate yourself in others and develop a real team of high potential employees, and the firm eventually can run without you, then that myth becomes less painful. It becomes more joyful. And the difficulty of building a firm that can run without you, goes down, and your success rate goes up in proportions to that. Now, all of you are going to be getting a copy of my new book, I hope within the next 2 weeks, God willing. We're having some supply chain issues, but we've had a breakthrough in the last week, so I'm looking forward to that. That book is titled The Founder Bottleneck, which is what we're talking about today. Its subtitle is How to Scale Yourself. Now, in that, I'm going to put forward Greg's point of view and detailed solution on succession planning. And that's how to truly build a firm that doesn't require you to run it. So someday you can ride off into the sunset with a bucket of cash and go do whatever else you want to do in life. But there's steps along the way. And one of those steps is not completely replacing yourself, but amplifying yourself by having support services do things for you that could really kind of multiply your impact on your firm. And one of those support services, one of those roles that we advocate for is called the Chief of Staff. So we're going to dive into that. Now, I want to make sure that no one leaves this call thinking that that's the silver bullet to replicating yourself. It's not. It's one tool in a toolbox. It's a really cool tool. Think of it as a Swiss Army knife that can do a lot of things, but it's one tool, it's one tactic. But we want to give you something that potentially you could sink your teeth into and get going on it, and that's this Chief of Staff role. So we've got a great role model with us today, Bryon Morrison. Why is he qualified to talk about this? Well, 3 reasons in my view. First, he has a long and storied successful career in the marketing agency world. And we have a lot of marketing agencies in our boutique. And he did in that world what many of you are trying to do. So he's got some direct relevance around that, including becoming part of the Omnicom umbrella and operating within that for 10 years. And we'll get to that in a moment. Secondly, he owns the largest membership organization in the world for chiefs of staff. It's called the Chief of Staff Roundtable. So I remember, I don't quite remember what the count is, but it's several hundred chiefs of staff that he's engaging with on a regular basis, which gives him a really interesting perspective on this. And then third, his business is called Proxxy. And what does he do? He provides you, busy founders, with professionally trained remote chiefs of staff. Now, I promise you, I'm not going to violate our code of conduct, and this is not a sales pitch. If it becomes a sales pitch, we'll hit mute on Bryon and dismiss him from the meeting, and we'll continue our dialogue. But we will not have to do that because Bryon is a grown-up and he knows not to turn this into a sales pitch. However, if you do pick his brain and you like what he has to say, I would encourage you to reach out to him and see if this makes sense for you. Several of our members in Collective are his clients, and he's got fantastic client satisfaction. So because of that, I feel comfortable putting him in front of you this morning. So Bryon, with that, let me turn it over to you and see if you wouldn't mind properly introducing yourself to the group.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. You're right. I'm proud to be starting the next 100 expert sessions with you guys as 101. And I've gotten so much from all of these. I've been involved in it for a very long time with Collective 54, and it's been incredibly important to me and my business. So I hope that I can give back that value today and give you guys some ideas on how to start to replicate yourself. Just quick background on myself. I am a serial entrepreneur. I've had a couple of really nice exits, and I've gotten through plenty of learning moments that weren't as great, and that's okay. So I've gone through mostly around digital marketing. That's been my background. And as Greg mentioned, in Omnicom, I specialized in doing turnarounds and helping scale agencies. And so in that process, I started working with amazing organizations like, AT&T and Boeing and Victoria's Secret and Limited Brands and PepsiCo. And in that, we started to identify this role of chief of staff. And I just felt like it was one of the most incredibly important pivotal roles because they're amazing master generalists. They bring a level of project management that is incredible discipline to the organization, and they're great communicators. And so it just inspired me to try and figure out, I just always thought to myself, God, I wish I would have had something like that when I was starting and running businesses. And so, I spent several years kind of deconstructing that role and rethinking how it could be applied to small to medium-sized businesses. And that's essentially what became Proxxy. And I feel like we don't have any kind of a financial relationship between us and Collective 54, but I feel like I should constantly send checks to Greg because he gives us such great ideas and feedback and projects to do. And none of us have enough time to actually go execute those. And so that's oftentimes what your Proxxy ends up doing.
Yeah. Okay, great. So Bryon, these calls are what we call role model sessions. And that word role model is a very precise word here at Collective 54. And what it's meant to say is this is a peer community. And the word peer, I think, at times gets overused. And our definition of a peer is somebody in professional services. So that's the first thing. So anyone who's not in ProServe doesn't get allowed in. We believe that industry context matters a lot. And somebody who's in the segment of ProServe called the boutique, which is kind of post-startup, pre-scale, pre-exit. Think of it as an adolescence period, or if we want to use an analogy to our own lives, maybe that awkward time of puberty, where we were no longer a kid, but we weren't an adult, but we wanted to be an adult. And that's really what we focus on. And Bryon, your past is filled with experiences that many of our marketing and advertising agency members, of which we have quite a few, would benefit from. So if I understand it correctly, I'm going to summarize and correct me where I'm wrong, is you were a creative director turned entrepreneur who sold your agency to Omnicom. Then you worked in Omnicom within their holding company framework, and you fixed and scaled a bunch of other agencies. I mean, am I correct there?
Yeah, and like I said, it was always kind of oriented around marketing and technology. So I had more of a CRM orientation in one organization. We turned around the first mobile marketing agency in the US, and that was Ipsh. And so went there, and then we rolled that into TMA, which was one of the largest experiential marketing firms in the country. And so, yeah, I was blessed to see it from a lot of different angles.
Okay, very good. All right, so I'm going to start. I just got 3 questions I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to turn it over to the group. So the first question is, and it's basic, but it's important. I don't think many of us really understand the pure definition of a chief of staff. So what is it?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, it's an individual who works across the entire organization, and their primary focus is to drive the vision and operationalize the vision of their executive. So if you're in a Fortune 500 company like Microsoft, I think there's 3,000 chiefs of staff in that organization, because they work every director and above. And so they typically bring with them exceptional project management skills. They're great communicators, and they understand metrics, and they're data driven.
Okay.
And so it's a unique and sometimes difficult role to find, which is why but when you get it right, It's the most incredible role because they can fit anywhere. Like you said, that Swiss Army knife is a great metaphor. The one thing that I think is also key to this is that they're a truth broker. We consistently talk about that phrase, somebody who is capable of saying to you things that nobody else in the organization says, and you have to be able to separate any kind of biases. So, that's the thing that's kind of unique about that chief of staff role is you'll often have extremely intimate discussions with that person that you can't have with other people. So you have to be careful about, what are their biases? What do you incent them to do so that they don't, start operating the wrong way?
And how is a chief of staff different than an executive assistant?
It's a great question. So the executive assistant is literally there to serve in some of the small functions that you were talking about before, repeatable things. They're all about you as the individual, like scheduling, managing email correspondence, taking care of some of those small repeat functions. And some EAs actually will continue to elevate into that role in smaller firms. The difference, though, is a chief of staff, when you're typically seeing somebody who's been in a chief of staff role, they were an SVP or they were a VP in their organization, and they know functionally how to drive the business. And so they move into that role where they become basically number two to the executive that they're working with.
Sometimes I hear founders say, I'm a small company. That's a job you find in big companies. It doesn't apply to me, which I think is a mistake, but I'd love to get your perspective on why you think a chief of staff is particularly relevant to a founder of a small business.
Yeah, I think it is difficult, right? Because typically a chief of staff, if you get a really good chief of staff, that's a $150,000 to $250,000 role. Like, they're exceptionally good. But if there was a place where they could ever fit and make a difference, it's in small to medium-sized businesses, because that's where we have gaps. Every one of us wants a better marketing person on our team, or wants a better HR person on our team, or R&D or ops. And that chief of staff is capable, if they're really good, they're capable of morphing across those until you find the absolute right person. So that's why I think for SMBs, it's incredibly important. And again, I also recognize that pricing is really difficult for some people, which is why we kind of deconstructed the role and looked at what was really important and put that into a different format. So again, I don't want to pitch that, but that was the idea of Proxxy, is how do we figure out a way to make this affordable and effective for SMBs.
And I think that's the reason why it makes sense for this to be a remote person, because your model allows this job that might be out of reach from an affordability perspective to the small business owner now becomes affordable because of the way that you do it. Okay, so those are my questions, really. I mean, we'll jump into more into, kind of how you do it and the impact it will have. The last thing I would just leave, which is a statement, not a question, but maybe to stimulate some questions. In the end, the value proposition is this: are you working too much? The answer to that question is yes. Then a chief of staff buys you back time. How much time? Tough to say right now, but substantial amount of time. And the next thing you should think about is, okay, so if all of a sudden I had an extra day a week, let's just say for an easy example, what would I do with it? In my life, when I had my boutique, I had a chief of staff. Now, we didn't call this person a chief of staff because I wasn't intelligent enough to do it, but I had two co-founders. And the way that we defined our jobs, we clearly had a chief of staff. He was an ex-naval officer, 11 years on a submarine, and he was an absolute project management guru. And our firm does not become who it became without that individual. And he did most of these jobs, and it was just incredible. What that allowed me to do as the founder is that I had all these visionary things I wanted to get to. And if I didn't have a chief of staff, I just flat out don't get them. So instead of going cradle to grave in 10 years and exiting for the amount that I exited for on the terms I exited for, I'd still be clicking away. Year 15, 16, 17, incrementally building brick by brick this nice little lifestyle business. Now, that's not for us. You join Collective 54 because you want more than that. Your ambition is bigger than that. And that's where something like a chief of staff comes into play. Okay, so Lisa, I'll throw it over to you. I think you're facilitator today, and let's see if we can get some brave people to start asking some questions. It's always tough to go first. So who's going to go first today?
All right, Greg, thanks. Yeah. Who has, oh, Ted. Hello. I
Ted
see
always
your
goes
hand
first.
up. That's great.
Thanks. Thanks everyone and Bryon for coming on. So I'm sitting here listening to this, and probably like a lot of folks, this sounds wonderful. I'm just having trouble figuring out how you would define that scope, because you read the book Rocket Fuel, it talks about having, one partner be the visionary and the other the execution person. How do you decide whether what you need is another partner or, a chief of staff? I just find that defining the scope of work complicated or not clear to me.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Ted, because if you're in an organization where you have a fantastic integrator, which Rocket Fuel would say, the visionary should be matched with an integrator, then the chief of staff role may not be right, because those two have to work really closely together. And I think a perfect example of this is if you watch Greg and Jeff and how Collective 54 operates. Jeff's an exceptional operator. And so the chief of staff role right now probably isn't right for an organization like Collective 54, because it might get in the way. But if you don't have those kinds of people next to you, and you've got somebody that you want to bring along, like we work with organizations where they say, I'm the visionary, I'm the integrator, but the integrator is not ready to take that role. And that doesn't mean you can wait around, and it doesn't mean you can just, invest in that person and hope that eventually they get there. We typically will come in as an executive multiplier and help drive strategic initiatives like succession planning or exit planning or management methodologies. So we'll bring those strategic things that are going to drive the business forward, but also help you try and identify those individuals, raise those up for succession, and then help facilitate that process.
Ted, let me give you my 2 cents on this if I can. Just because you take a partner and you put the title of integrator on the partner doesn't mean overnight they become the integrator. They have no idea how to be an integrator. They haven't been trained on how to be an integrator, to use the EOS mentality. So I suggest that that's the wrong approach, and that this is a very specific set of skills, and kind of renting an external third party, make sure that you have someone who's trained in the best practices of being a chief of staff. And as Bryon mentioned earlier, which I cannot stress enough, they're objective and they're a truth broker. If I was to do it over again in my own journey, I would not have had my co-founder in this role, because where there was friction, and there was a lot of friction, I got more gray hair in my head than I would like because of that, it's because he always had an agenda. He was pushing his agenda, asking for budget and people, etc. And I knew that, and those are negotiations that happen within a company. But if you got a third party, there's no agenda. The agenda is the balance sheet. What am I doing to increase the value of my firm? What am I doing to create enterprise value? What am I doing to make myself more compelling to my clients? So that's a real big distinction. So you don't have a chief of staff when you just say, hey, Joe, you're the integrator. It's not that easy. That would be like pointing at Greg and saying, dunk a basketball. I'm never going to be able to dunk a basketball. I'm 5'9" and I got a 1-inch vertical leap. It's never going to happen. Right. So you would rent one of those people that's trained that way. Hopefully that helps.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Ted. Catalina, I see your hand up.
Hi, yes, thank you. So I have two quick questions. The first one is, I may be being a bit daft, but I'm struggling to find the difference between an operations person and a chief of staff. Maybe it just depends on the size of your business and the amount of big projects that any given individual can manage. But then parallel to that, like, I have a marketing agency right now, but I grew up in investment banking, and there was a chief of staff that was literally like in charge of delegating deals that would come in and pass them to the different analysts, and you would basically like hide under the desk when he would come around the corner. But the other thing that was interesting, and so that makes more sense because it's like he was literally the chief of staff. And then the role would interestingly get passed around every 6 months, depending on like your level. So is that the evolution of the chief of staff role that we're talking about here? Is it a coincidence that they're called the same thing? Like, surely the actual name is coming from something that links to managing staff. So I'm just wondering if you could like talk a bit to that.
Yeah, the role was born out of military and government. It's been prevalent there for a long time. There were instances of it before that, but it was literally chief of staff, meaning they're in charge of everybody. And so they allow the CEO to be the visionary and to be the, they free them to be able to get things done. So that handles that piece of it. The difference between your COO and the chief of staff is the COO is the person who's making sure operationally an organization is running by the metrics that it's supposed to. They have the day-to-day responsibilities of driving and being consistent in the business. The chief of staff is going to work on initiatives that might be future, might be more CEO's vision, might be, you might see those as special projects. So if you're like me, most of us are visionaries if we're in the executive role, excuse me, and as an entrepreneur. And I don't know about you guys, but I had a whiteboard that had so many ideas on it that eventually I couldn't erase the whiteboard anymore. I can't go belabor my staff with that and go, I got an idea. I want to think about this. I want to go research this. Let's go think about how this could impact us on the long term. I need to make sure that the team is doing the job that they already know how to do. And so I kind of refer to it as bimodal management. It's kind of a tech term, but the idea of there's part of the organization is consistency. They're really good at doing what they do on a consistent basis. But then you have another part of the company that's thinking about how am I going to keep improving that? And those are two typically different mindsets. So that's kind of the difference, in terms of the types of initiatives that I would expect a COO to have versus a chief of staff. So you had a few things in there. I don't know if I answered all those, Catalina. Does that help?
Yes, it helps. Thanks.
So Catalina, when my firm is about where yours is, and I know your firm a little bit because we've had a chance to speak, let me tell you the problem that I would cause. So I had an operations person and we would sell work, and the ops person was in charge with delivering the work on time, on spec, on budget, with a certain profit target. That was a full-time job. And then because I was always thinking about the future, well, we should do this and we should do that, and someday we should do this. And then I, as a visionary, did not have the ability to execute. I needed help executing it. So I would go to the ops person and I would say, hey, we should go do these 5 things. And the ops person would say, okay, what about today's current business do you want me to stop doing? I mean, I'm already working 60 hours a week. Like, do you want me to go fire this client, or do you want me to slow down this project? Because where am I going to squeeze this in? Like, what's the priority? And we used to get in these fights about priority all the time. And when I was a young, immature founder, it used to drive me crazy. And all I used to say to him is, holy cow, you are slow as shit. Will you pedal faster is what I used to say. And he used to get so mad at me and he should have, because
Sounds familiar to me.
he was pedaling so fast and doing such a great job. And this is my point. When you're trying to scale, particularly a young firm, trying to accelerate to scale, there's just too much work. So you have a choice. You either slow down your pace of growth and you just accept scaling at a more moderate pace, which I was an impatient SOB, so I wasn't willing to do that. Or you find somebody else, which in this case, we recommend a chief of staff, somebody other than the ops person, to go work on these things. So what we settled on was the great methodology from Jeffrey Moore, the Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. And we said the ops person owned Horizon 1, which was this year's P&L. And by the way, and if he did a poor job, there wasn't any money to go invest in Horizon 2, which was years 2 through 5. And then Horizon 3, which we often didn't get to because things would change, would be, 5+ years and beyond. And that's how we delineated them. Ops had to hit this year's number. The chief of staff was working on next year's number. Because a lot of these initiatives that you want to get going, you don't just flick a switch and they show up tomorrow. These are multi-month, in some cases, multi-year efforts. And that's the kind of thing that this chief of staff would work on for me anyways.
Man, Greg, just to add on to that, I think that's one of the main things that I find is how many people underestimate how fast an organization can absorb new ideas and new work. We literally talk about an absorption rate, a management metabolism. How fast can your organization take new initiatives and concepts? And so when you're prioritizing it as a CEO, you need somebody who's going to look at you and go, let's not do that. It doesn't make sense. The ROI is not there. The level of effort is too high. It'll make sense 6 months from now. Let's reprioritize. And so when we go through that, hopefully what a chief of staff can do is break down full reality of what that initiative is going to take. And Greg, I think you nailed that. Most people, we never think about the communication piece of it. How am I going to track it longitudinally? Was there good data over time, and are we improving? We think about it as initiatives. We check the box and we move on a lot of times.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you. Tad, I see your hand up. Oh, Tad, are
Hey,
you there?
Tad.
Oh, well, we can come back to Tad. Does anyone else have a
Sorry,
question?
am I unmuted now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm tremendously tech challenged today, and I don't know what this is, but anyway, happy Friday, everybody. So a combination of a question for Greg and Jeff and for Bryon. You talked on Wednesday about, books, and from the different kinds of like the role models and the reading list and the mentor, the peers and the coach. Are there books around that you think, either books or tools, we should all think about reading specifically on this entrepreneurial myth, and even evaluating, where's our superpowers that need to be amplified through other people and trained, and where are our weaknesses from an actual tactical execution weakness type stuff, like we're talking about being able to get things off the whiteboard into action, as well as then kind of places where you say, just to go look at this from a holistic perspective, because I think the beginning of this is us thinking, okay, here's the things I need to go get from the people around me and help, like this. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so why don't I just recap for the audience that wasn't on the call Wednesday, real quickly, what Tad is talking about, because it's important. So this is outside of chief of staff, what we're talking about right now, but it is inside the scope of how to scale yourself as the founder. Okay. So this would be another tactic and this is essential to succession planning, which is a broader approach than just renting a chief of staff. So when you identify a high potential employee or high potential employees, these are people that are top performers in their current job, but they have more capacity to do more. And you say to yourself, okay, these are the people that are going to run the firm someday. I am going to replicate myself in this group. So the question is, how do you develop them? And in my view, and you'll see this in the book, is I think they need to be surrounded by 4 resources. The first resource is a role model. A role model has a very distinct definition. It's someone that you don't have access to or they don't have access to, but there are people who literally have modeled the role. And Chad's talking about books. And this is what I've used throughout my time. So for example, I had a consulting company, and it's my opinion, the greatest consulting company ever created is McKinsey. They invented the management consulting industry. And the father of McKinsey is a guy named Marvin Bower. And there's been 17 books written on Marvin Bower, and I've read every one of them. He was my role model. And I learned all kinds of things. Some of you have read my book, The Boutique. And prior to us meeting in the community, maybe I played that role for you, and that's a wonderful thing. You know, you said, oh, geez, this guy's done what I want to do, and you learn through that process. So that's a role model. Second one is a mentor. Mentor is different than a role model in that you meet with this mentor regularly. Maybe it's monthly, quarterly, twice a year, something like that. But the distinction with a mentor is the mentor has no skin in the game. The mentor is not the boss. The mentor is not the investor. The mentor is not a client. The relationship is pure. I play this role for some folks, and it's a truth-telling exercise, and I'm mentoring young people, and sometimes, you know, they need to be told some stuff they don't like to hear, and that's the mentor. And everybody needs a mentor, at least one, in my view. These high potential employees who you want to hand the baton to, they absolutely, positively need a mentor. Okay, the third one is peers. Peers are different than role models and mentors in the following way. Peers there's no difference in experience. There's literally somebody who has a job just like yours and a firm similar to yours dealing with the same kinds of problems. And these are more like therapy sessions. So you would meet with your peers, like, for example, I'm in YPO and I have a YPO forum, and I meet with them every month and we talk about all kinds of stuff. And it's just fantastic to hear kind of non-judgmental peers not looking at me saying, you should have done this or you should have done that. Instead, they're saying, oh yeah, shit, yeah, I'm in that situation right now. You know, let's talk through it together. So those are peers. And our power members at Collective 54 have leveraged Collective 54 this way. They have enrolled their high potential people into Collective 54 to try to locate their peers. And we can actually do a better job of that and do more of that by proactively identifying the right peers. And in the fourth and final role, it's a coach, and that's your role. Okay, you're supposed to be coaching your high potential employees. Why is that? Well, you're trying to replicate yourself. So no one else can be the coach. You have to teach them what you do. They have to do it as well as you can do it. And you got all that locked in your head. So only you can be the coach. And there's a specific way of doing that, of coaching, that I lay out in the book. So I just wanted to make sure everybody had that grounding that wasn't on the call. Now, as it relates to the chief of staff, and maybe finding some role models, some mentors, some peers in the chief of staff world, Bryon, do you have any suggestions around books or groups or things like that?
You know, I think that's really interesting. I think the bigger question is, what is the challenge that you're trying to attack? And so we heard somebody talk about rocket fuel earlier. You know, if an organization is trying to build their management methodology and be more consistent, there's plenty of choices to be made in terms of, you know, great business books. I love The Boutique. What we did is we've looked at all best practices, all of those books, all of those management methodologies, and broke those down by the scale and size and stage of a company. And so I don't necessarily have a specific book that I would recommend to go figure out, you know, what the right role of chief of staff is. But I do think that EOS has a really good understanding of this idea of an integrator and a visionary working together And most of the companies that are in Collective 54 are probably in that space, and in that size. So I think, Traction, Rocket Fuel, those are great places to start. But what they the thing that they do is they lay out, like, go try this, go work on this initiative and learn the following things. So it still comes back to, like, what am I going to activate?
Yep. So I'll give you some thoughts on some books. So all the EOS books are great. We love EOS. Vern Harnish's work, particularly around scaling up. That's an alternative to EOS. It's also really good. OKR is another set of books that is getting a lot of traction. Some people like it, some don't. Can even go back into the archives and think Six Sigma, think business process reengineering. These are all kind of management methodologies. And they're good. And I think everybody should have a system that they run their business on. Now, let me tell you where I think, spaghetti needs meatballs in order to be an entree. So these management methodologies, and let's just use EOS because I'm familiar with it and we use it. There has to be content that goes into the management methodology. So for example, EOS says you should have a scorecard. You should run your business based on data. Okay, great. So what should the metrics be? That's the reason why we believe in benchmarking, and we have the Collective 54 ProServe benchmark. They need to be industry-specific benchmarks, things like project profitability and utilization rates and bill rates, et cetera. They advocate for a meeting pulse. So there's a weekly meeting, a monthly same-page meeting, a quarterly offsite, and an annual meeting. Well, that's a lot of time. Let's say you got a management team of 5 people, and they're going to meet every week for an hour. That's 5 hours of management time per week, non-billable, times 50 weeks a year, times your bill rate. I mean, all of a sudden, those meetings are $20,000 meetings. I don't agree with that. Now, if you're going to have the meeting and you're going to invest all this non-billable time, the meetings better be productive. So that's what I mean. You need the content that goes into that meeting. So what are we going to talk about? That's where someone like a chief of staff might be really helpful there. It's not just a progress report. It's a, hey, we're working on this strategic initiative. We ran into a new obstacle. Let's brainstorm right now how to overcome it. Those types of things. EOS talks about the VTO, the vision tracks and organizer. You all need a vision. If you don't have a vision, you're not a founder. You're just a manager of a small business. Well, what's the vision for a professional services organization? Well, how do you know? Well, you need role models. You need peers. You need to see what's possible. That's why you belong to a community like Collective 54. It's got to be specific to you. Someone just telling you need a vision, like, okay, like help me through that. And that's where a chief of staff might be helpful.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Greg. Before I jump to you, Kyle, I'm going to just address Justin Roth's question in the chat. And Bryon, maybe you could just specifically address the reporting structure question that Justin had.
So what's the question?
He's specifically saying that he's we weren't sure that we've answered Catalina's question. The chief of staff is literally the chief of staff. Then the implication is that the head of operations does not own their resource pool. Why would this person be happy with that? Any other functional leader?
Yeah, let me just say this. One of the reasons that we don't talk about being a remote chief of staff and we talk about being an executive multiplier is because I think the title tends to ruffle feathers in some organizations. If you're in an organization that has deep functional skills in each one of the departments, they're exceptionally good, the chief of staff is going to work across those to make sure that there's consistency and that everybody is operating at the level that they're supposed to, and it frees the CEO to be the visionary and think about what's next. They don't necessarily run or drive those staff members. They work across the top level of the organization. So the chief of staff typically does not have any staff assigned to them. They're the masters of the matrix management, right? So they have to get along with everyone. They have to help drive the overarching vision forward. So Justin, if we came across as saying, I might have said that if I was speaking to like, the president's chief of staff in the White House, that individual is in charge of everybody. But it doesn't mean that you don't have functional experts that are still driving those teams and managing all aspects of it. Now, in other organizations, like I said, the reason we drop chief of staff and we just talk about it as an executive multiplier is because the point is you need to keep driving strategically initiatives in the organization that'll keep you moving forward. And the people who you already have can be focused on the day-to-day and making sure that they're really, really good at the job they have in front of them.
Yeah. So I hear you, Brian, but I disagree. I think the title of chief of staff is a great one because as a category, everybody has role model examples from the military as an example. So I think the chief of staff role should stay. Now, my chief of staff had no direct reports. However, all the people that reported to me knew the juice sat with the chief of staff. And when it came bonus time, if the strategic initiative didn't get done, and I was asking the chief of staff, hey, how did Bob do on initiative XYZ? And if it was Bob blew me off all year, Bob didn't get paid. So there was real kind of wood behind the arrow. He wasn't some quote unquote special projects guy and, had no teeth, just the opposite. But he didn't have any direct reports, but he had a lot of power, a ton of power.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that addresses the question more directly.
Thanks, Greg. Kyle, I see your hand up. Thank you for your patience.
No problem. I put my question in the chat, but I'll say what I had here. And I guess I've been watching a lot of different conferences over the last little while, hearing a lot about their usually marketing focused, but a quarter of the content seems to be about the lack of engagement in staff. Half of the staff in the world don't know what is expected of them, including their managers. And a lot of things seem to be around productivity and engagement and morale. And so my question was, the chief of staff, are there certain pain points that relate to that they help address? And if they don't have any direct reports, or if Microsoft has 3,000 of them, do they do that without any direct reports? And maybe it's different from company to company. So I had a list of some pain points that I hear people are trying to address. I'm curious if chief of staff helps with any of those, or if it's completely different. Some of the things I listed were like departmental silos, if there's toxic individuals in a company, staff productivity overall, prioritization of activities to make sure they're working on the right thing, alignment of action that's going on with the vision of the company, staff fulfillment and retention, overall morale, the culture, like transforming that culture maybe, and continuous improvements overall. So I realize some of these things might be COO, some of them might be a departmental manager, but curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, Kyle, I think you just said it, right? Every organization is different. And in some organizations, their HR function is very strategic and they have fantastic people. And so, you're not going to have, you're going to have the expectations framework for that staff. Maybe it comes from the HR group. And so if that's the case, then the chief of staff understands, is there an expectations framework in place? Do we know what that should look like? Can we define that together with the functional expert? And so some of these things like departmental silos, that's a CEO level consideration. We have to figure out how to eliminate departmental silos. That's absolutely something that you would say a chief of staff would look at and go, how do we do that across an organization? Toxic individuals, an HR function should already take care of that. But if you're in an organization that doesn't have a great HR function, then that oftentimes will fall on the chief of staff. Like we get involved in that quite a bit. Staff productivity, yeah, that tends to, if you've got a great COO, maybe the COO is going to handle that. If you don't have a great COO, that would easily fall on the chief of staff responsibilities. So it's really anything, and I could keep going through each one of those, and I'm happy to do that separately, but I just want to make sure we get all the questions answered. But alignment of action with vision, 100% chief of staff.
Yep.
That's a CEO driven initiative. So that's the way I look at this, is anything that is CEO driven and there's not a functional expert that naturally falls into place with, then the chief of staff often is the one who drives that.
So it sounds
Well,
like it enables the CEO to be hands-off, focus on the high level stuff that they need to focus on. Chief of staff ensures that the ideas and the vision is getting implemented by the functional people, and is there to consult or coach as needed those people on what areas need to get implemented or what the priorities might be.
I don't think so. In a big company, yes. In a small company, the people who are on this call, no. Here's what happens. You just rattled off a dozen things. I mean, if you're the CEO of a marketing agency, good luck trying to get all 12 of those things done quickly. It's just not going to happen. So you sit down with your chief of staff and you say, okay, I got these ones and you got those. I'll give you an example. Marketing agencies are driving me crazy right now. The reason why they're driving me crazy is they're laying off their people. And they're laying off their people because their founders are not doing a good job running their firms. I posted a chart on the chart of the week a few weeks back talking about utilization rates. Utilization rates right now in the marketing agencies are about 50%. And a consulting company, oh my God, like that would be a 911 emergency call. What is going on? But for some reason in the creative world, we tolerate those things. You can't tolerate those things. You're not a nonprofit business. You're a for-profit business. So if a CEO said to himself, somebody that was running an agency, maybe a recovering creative director who's now trying to be an entrepreneur and understand business, oh my gosh, I've got to run my agency like a real pro serve firm. That means I got to track utilization rates. How do I do it? That's a great project for a chief of staff to go run and execute with a very tight scope, pass-fail criteria, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the types of things. So in a small company, Kyle, just to be clear, it's not the CEO delegating his job to the chief of staff so he or she can go off in la la land and dream wonderful things. That's not it. The issue is there's too much shit to do. So, and you want to go quickly, you can't get it all done yourself. So you need your right hand, so to speak, to be able to take those firm building initiatives, not this client or this big project or this big hire, but these kind of multi-year infrastructure like firm building activities. So just want to keep it real. That's the reality when you're in a small business.
So is it adding more horsepower to the integrator potentially?
I would suggest in a small business, you don't need both. If you've got a kick-ass integrator, then don't hire a chief of staff. If you've got somebody who's an integrator in name only and also has a full-time day job, then maybe renting a chief of staff out externally makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think what you nailed there, Greg, is that every company comes out of it. When you're at a different scale and you're at a different stage in the business, the chief of staff role morphs with the organization. So you're 100% right. Like in small businesses, the chief of staff becomes that person that drives HR because you can't afford to have a full C-suite in an SMB.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bryon. John Kraft, I see your hand up.
I don't have a question. I have some observations and comments. Is that okay?
Absolutely. I always love your observations.
I do too.
So Greg said something that really struck me. I was too stupid to know something like this, that I had a chief of staff when I had him. I want to remind everybody on this call this, because I heard a question asked by Catalina, and I think her brain might work like mine, where she's trying to establish this foundational knowledge and know exactly what that is from the world of banking and math before she goes forward. Man, this meeting, and I even invited my wife here, who is a Microsoft chief of staff. And I'm going to tell you folks this right now. If you walk by the hallway by her at One Microsoft, you'd be like, oh, that chick has her shit together. But my wife is sitting here thinking, I'm a chief of staff. Oh my God. So listen, man, this is a hard one. You are not going to know that chief of staff when they show their head at your company. You're not going to know it at first. I'm telling you, because I could say the same thing Greg said. I got a Green Beret A-team leader who was closest as I could find to a Marine Corps staff sergeant, who was going to do the crappy stuff and not sweat it sometimes. I would say a chief of staff, you can't really define that role. They are an extension of the CEO and the executive. I could execute to an extent, and then I'm like, I'm bored now. I want to go sit in the woods and create more chaos. That's me. Some of you other founders may be excellent executors, and maybe you don't need that role covered. or maybe I don't still understand what a chief of staff is. But what I can say is this is not an easy role to define, and it is going to be different for every leader and every company. I think I kept that under 4.5 hours. So, you know, if you guys think I'm way out there with this, you know,
No, I think you're dead on.
Okay, he has a hard job to try to explain to us what a chief of staff is. You know, Greg's saying it from his real world experience. And then we mix in what they're saying, and everybody here might hear something different.
Yep.
Man, I'm glad I take Fridays off after these meetings.
You're correct. So the idea that we're putting on the table today is an idea. And you can throw it out, you can morph it, you can implement it as is, you know, that's up to you. Our job is to present possibilities, options for you to consider. Here's how maybe I'll conclude the teaching of the day, and then Lisa, you can handle the wrap up. And it's this: if you're somebody who's been a member of Collective 54 for a while, and you get off these calls and you get off your leadership boards and the monthly speaker series, all the stuff that we do, and you say, oh my goodness, I now know what I need to do. And there's like 25 things to get to. How the heck am I going to get all this done? And before I expose myself to yet another great idea, I've got this backlog of ideas that I need to push through. If that is you, consider a chief of staff. If that is not you, and you're still in this exploratory stage, educating yourself, what does it mean to scale a professional services firm, which by the way is completely acceptable, then maybe it's a little premature for this role. But I've talked to many of you and they say, you know, I get off these Friday sessions and I'm reminded what little I know. I get depressed because I go to my notes and I'm like, wow, I got 30 things I got to get done. How am I going to get them all done? Well, you might have to staff it with a chief of staff, executive multiplier, whatever you want to call this person, to get these strategic initiatives done. Maybe, or maybe you can push them through. Maybe you're big enough at this point, you've got enough people inside your company that they can take on these initiatives. And that's the preferable solution, because now you don't have to add any expense to it. But if everybody's already pegged, you know, and they're already working you know what off, if you don't staff it, then these things aren't going to get implemented. And you're not going to scale. And you're definitely not going to exit someday. So that's how I would end it, and maybe kind of chunk that up in practical terms. So Lisa, why don't you bring us home?
All right. Well, thank you, Greg. That was really fantastic. On behalf of our community, I would like to thank Bryon for being today's role model. It's because of generous members like Bryon that our collective wisdom grows each and every week. You can learn more about Bryon and connect with him in the member portal, and we are dropping his profile in the chat. Next week's topic is episode 102, how a young and small firm became Monday.com's #1 North American partner in less than 3 years. Our role model will be Noah Burke, and the co-founder of OBO, and he will talk about how he has mastered his go-to-market strategy to accelerate revenue growth. This is an outstanding case study, and you won't want to miss it. So as always, we appreciate and take your feedback seriously. If you don't mind, to please take a moment and respond to the poll that you should be seeing on your screen now. I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks, Bryon.
Bye, everybody.
Appreciate you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great work,
Appreciate
Bryon.
it.